This house would arm the police. Proposition. Introduction. So, I love debating. Like, proper competitive. It's a sport, no seriously stop laughing guys. Debating. I've put a link to an example of a debate in the description below. It's long, but you only have to watch one speech to get an idea of how it works. With this series I hope to explore some debating motions, and show the arguments on both sides. Hopefully this won't just be interesting for debaters, but for anyone interested in some of the big issues in society. For each motion I will do 2 videos, one in favour of it, the other against it. Today's motion is, this house would arm the police, and I will be arguing in favour of it today. But first, some background on the motion. So, in the UK, where I live and debate, the police aren't armed. We, along with Norway, Ireland and New Zealand, notice how 2 of those are closely related to Britain, are the only countries where regular police officers aren't armed. The reason for this is historical. All police in Britain are based on the London Metropolitan Police, who were created in a time when the military was seriously disliked. So the creator of the police force tried to emphasise the difference between the police and the army so people wouldn't resent the police too. To this end, the police wore blue, while the army redcoats, unsurprisingly, wore red. And the police didn't have guns, again, unlike the army. However, recent events, such as the shooting of 2 officers in Manchester, have raised questions about the current state of affairs. Should British police be unarmed in this modern age? It should also be made clear at this point that in Britain, gun-related murders are rarer, far rarer than in the United States, and much rarer than our European neighbour, France. I should also note that in talks about arming the police in the UK, people ignore Northern Ireland, where police are already armed. I'm no expert on the reasons for this, but considering Northern Ireland's troubled history and issues with terrorism and such, it is a special incident that needs separate consideration to the rest of the UK in this matter. Now, on with the proposition arguments. The problem. All debate should start with the definition of a grand problem that you plan to solve with this new policy. Arguments should be tailored around this problem, and the opposition should focus on why your case doesn't solve the problem, or why the problem doesn't exist in the first place. For this debate, I see there are 3 major problems that can be identified, which all say basically the same thing, but with important, if slight, differences. 1. The public cannot be protected by an unarmed police force. 2. Officers' lives are put at risk when they don't carry guns. 3. Criminals have a fundamental advantage over an unarmed police force. These differences may seem arbitrary, but the important difference is who they establish as the most important actor to be considered. Problem 1 establishes the general public as the primary concern. Problem 2, the police officers. And problem 3, the criminals themselves. Depending on which problem you choose, your first and biggest point should focus on that group specifically. So for this video, I will look at each problem and the point that should come with it. But first I must provide a mechanism, explain what this policy would actually look like in practice, and how I would deal with its consequences. In explaining how this motion works, first you want to explain what you mean by police officer. In this case, every officer would have a gun, from the armed response teams who are already armed under the status quo, to the beat cop that patrols the streets, to the detectives. Then you want to explain the kind of gun. You want to make it clear you aren't letting officers run around with bazookas. I would say that regular cops and detectives would be issued with a handgun, since it acts as a weapon without being too intimidating. Officers would keep a shotgun in the car just in case, and specialist police, armed response teams, airport police, etc., could keep their honking great assault rifles and submachine guns or whatever they carry, as under the status quo. At every incident in which an officer fired a shot, the event would be investigated to ensure the use of the gun was legitimate. Use of guns in inappropriate situations would result in a suspension from police duty for the officer. If they killed an innocent, they would face a criminal court on murder charges. Any officer who shot a human would be taken off duty and made to see a psychiatrist to ensure their mental stability over this potentially traumatizing event. Police guns would all be registered and regularly checked, so stolen or sold guns would be identified quickly. The guns would also have microchips in them so they could be located. All officers would be required to pass a standardized firearms test as part of the entry test. Those already in the force would have to pass the test to keep their job. All officers and would-be officers would be provided with training, since that is hard to receive in the UK with its minimal guns and major gun control. With the mechanism out of the way, now to go on to my points, which, as I said before, would be split into 3. Point 1. The public cannot be protected by an unarmed police force. Whenever you make a point, you always need to analyse it fully to explore its meaning. To do this, I ask 2 questions of every point I think of. Why? And so what? So let's ask why the public cannot be protected by unarmed police. It's quite simple, really. The police are authority, or at least instruments of authority, and therefore need some way of establishing authority. But if they have no means of doing this, then they cannot establish themselves as authority. Guns are the means by which British police can establish authority. Very few civilians have them, so these guns clearly put the police into a position of power over the people. More importantly, though, few criminals have guns either, meaning the police having guns means criminals no longer have the upper hand over police. Take the example of Raoul Moat, who went on a killing spree and shot several people. He committed the crime before an armed response squad could arrive, and no regular police could stop him, since they had nothing to use against his shotgun. People's lives were lost because the police were not in a position to protect them. So what? Well, the obvious reason this is bad is that civilians are dying and the police are powerless to stop this. Preventing the death of innocents is generally a good enough reason for most things. But events like Raoul Moat are very rare in the UK. Potentially rare enough so as not to justify arming the police. So you have to talk about the wider social damages of having a police force incapable of defending the public. The damage is that people lose faith in the police. The police are there to protect them, and if the police can't do that, then what are they good for? If the police are only arresting those which don't present a threat, vandals and petty thieves, and avoid legitimately dangerous criminals because they are not in a position to handle them, the public begin to see the police at best as unnecessary, at worst as hypocrites, sapping on the taxpayers' money without actually being able to do their job, or as enemies that are wrongly targeting the petty and desperate without being able to handle criminals that really present a threat to society. This kind of dissatisfaction with the police is devastating in the long run. It can be argued that the London riots were partly a result of a lack of respect and a feeling of resentment towards the police. People began rioting because they had no respect or faith in the police, and continued rioting because they did not respect the police enough to fear them, and therefore did not fear the possibility of getting caught and stopped. It sounds bad to say that people should fear the police, but if people don't fear the police, they will not respect their authority and feel justified in rising up against the system in forms such as riots. If the police can assert their authority, then their social damage will be reduced. People will trust the police can deal with criminals and keep them safe. Without an armed police force, it can be argued that the very stability of society and the safety of state institutions is compromised. It's rather like owning a house with a watchdog that everyone knows is old and blind, not a threat in the slightest. The police is how the government imposes its will upon the people, and without an effective watchdog, then the government cannot impose its will, and therefore cannot ensure the security of society. In summary, the police's priority is to protect the people. Without guns, they fail to do this, like in the case of Raoul Moat. If the public realise that the police cannot protect them, they resent the police and the government for incompetence, and become far more likely to rise up in violent protest and crime, since they have no respect or fear of the police. Only when the social contracts are fulfilled, only when the police protect the people, will the relationship between these groups be peaceful, and can the government reign and implement its policies as is chosen by the democracy. You will see soon that a large part of this debate is on what the purpose of the police actually is. In this problem, problem 1, then the purpose of the police is to impose the will of the government. And without having authority and without having the respect of the civilians, it cannot impose the will of the government, and therefore leaves the government weak, and leaves the people with a feeling, with a want, to rise up against the government, and a feeling that they have no reason to fear the government, or in fact to respect the government's laws. Other methods of looking at this debate redefine the purpose of the police, and that is in fact a large part of what this debate revolves around. Point 2. Officers' lives are put at risk when the police don't have guns. This argument focuses on the police themselves as actors, and the effect that not having guns has on them. Let's look at the example of Fiona Bone and Nicola Hughes, two officers who were recently shot and killed in Manchester. Their case is tragic, and an example of the necessity of arming police. While we cannot say for certain that had those officers had guns, they would have been able to protect themselves, at least with guns they would have stood a chance. Unfortunately, under the situation, the two officers had no effective means of stopping a criminal armed with a gun, and thus their lives were forfeit. It is reality that officers will occasionally find themselves in situations wherein they need guns and cannot wait for an armed response squad. While it is admittedly uncommon, the very fact that it is a theoretical possibility, and the fact that the police may find themselves in situations where they have no means of preventing their death, presents huge problems. Like in the first point, the obvious problem is that officers die, and that is a clear tragedy, and I've already talked about the effect of the helplessness of the police has on the public. But what about the effect it has on the officers? What it does is it makes them scared, and rightly so. Any of them could have reported to the call that resulted in the deaths of those two officers that day. When the police begin fearing for their lives and doubt their ability to protect themselves, this creates serious problems with the force as a whole. Namely, the police become hesitant and unwilling to perform their jobs. Without the reassurance of a gun, they refuse to take potential risks, to apprehend criminals, and to respond to calls. I understand that an armed UK police force would rarely use its guns, and it has no need for them almost all of the time. But the fact remains that it is possible that a gun could be needed, and equipping officers reassures them of their ability to cope with problems, and reassures them of their own ability and power. The effect of this demoralized police force that is created under the status quo feeds into the problems of public dissatisfaction with the police as I stated under problem 1, and also feeds into issues with crime, which I shall mention under point 3. But fundamentally, the point here is that without a gun, the police will not properly fulfill their job because they fear that in situations where they need guns, they will not be ready. This problem doesn't speak much about the nature of the police force and its role, but implies the idea that the police should be there to stop criminals and protect the public, which is different to the definition of the police provided under point 1. Problem 3. Criminals have a fundamental advantage over an unarmed police force. This is what I consider the strongest point on the side of the proposition, and incorporates my most favourite of debating things, a circular chain of events. As a side note, this is an excellent debate for circular chains of events. There is a brilliant one on the opposition side, which I shall hopefully come to in a later video. Anyway. In a similar way to how police feel less confident when they don't have guns, criminals feel more confident when they realize the police force is incapable of protecting itself. If the police cannot protect themselves, and the police are in fact intimidated by the power of criminals, many of whom can access guns without any trouble at all, then they have the upper hand over the police. Especially when it comes to gangs, they can effectively take over parts of a city. We see this phenomenon in America, where certain ghettos are simply too dangerous for police to enter. And we see that this effect would be even more pronounced in the UK, where the police don't even have guns that could at least put them on equal footing to these gangs. You may wonder about this line of argument. Surely if the gangs could take over, they would have. But most cities are relatively safe in the UK. However, we see that the recent shootings in Manchester will act like a wake-up call to the criminals, a call that says, hey look, the police really are vulnerable after all, you can beat them. The relationship between police and criminals depends on criminals fearing the police. If that isn't the case, then criminals can do as they wish. Now for the circular chain of events I mentioned. If the police are unarmed, then criminals will see this and realize they have a potential advantage there. The criminals will arm themselves in order to exploit this advantage. When other criminals realize that certain criminals are arming themselves, they too will acquire guns, inspiring other criminals to get guns. You see, criminals, especially gangs, are often in competition, and so don't want to be put at a disadvantage to other criminals. What you get is effectively an arms race between ne'er-do-wells. As criminals start to arm themselves and start to stake out territory the police are unable to enter since they can't defend themselves in those areas, citizens will start wanting to get guns to protect themselves. However, they can't, not under British law, and will have to buy guns from the very criminals they want to protect themselves from. This means that a large market of both criminals and civilians will open up for arms dealers, and more will flock to Britain, which will just increase the number of armed criminals. It's a circular chain of events that just means more criminals have guns, and therefore more criminals can commit gun crime, and therefore more criminals and more dead people and more guns, and it's just awful, frankly. In summary, when criminals realise that the police can't defend themselves, the criminals will arm themselves in order to exploit this advantage. Then, criminals will just keep arming themselves, and then civilians will arm themselves, and then arms dealers will come, and then more criminals will arm themselves, and basically it creates this terrible circular chain of events. This argument very much emphasises the idea that, above all else, the police need to stop criminals, and that the responsibility of the police is to stop crime. So, that's what makes it very different to problem 1. And if you decide to run problem 3 before problem 1, or vice versa, you have to make sure that you do change the points so they're not contradicting each other on the purpose of the police. In conclusion, I do think that the third argument here, the one about more criminals, is the strongest, purely because this really is a debate about reducing crime, and a lot of it is based around that. So an argument saying, hey guys, if we don't arm the police then crime is gonna soar, is a strong one. What else is there to say? Nothing really. I mean, it's important to remember that when I present these 3 problems, they're not mutually exclusive, obviously. You can run all 3 of them, and in fact, they're really strongest if you run all 3 of them. I mean, sort of, if you say 2 of them, your partner says 1 of them, or however you want to organize it. Because what you do is you sort of present collective harms. It's an interesting case I've put forward here, frankly, because it's not saying things are gonna get much better if we arm the police, it's saying things are gonna get much worse if we don't arm the police, which isn't normally how these things go, but you know, it's fine. You're allowed to do that. Yeah, but importantly about this, about the idea of running all of these arguments together, the reason you should do it is because they reinforce each other. The effect of public dissatisfaction is much more pronounced if it seems that criminals are running amok. The fear of the police is much more severe if the public are dissatisfied and the public are sort of rebelling against the police, and they hold each other up like this. So yeah. Is there anything else to say? Not really. Thank you very much for listening, and in a later video I will present the opposition arguments to this House would arm the police. Thank you.